It had been a day of great imaginings. Katie learned that if you dress up like a queen and you use your imagination, you can really feel like one. Orbie discovered that even a cardboard box can become a rocket if you can imagine. And they both found out that when you put two imaginations together, some really interesting things happen. Katie and Orbie hunted down the sidewalk for the great Hooga Booga monster. It was rarely found in these parts, and it threatened to capture the fairy princess. Just then, Mrs. Perrette called to them from her front steps. They were so deeply into their game that Katie leapt and grabbed Orbie to save him from the Hooga Booga monster. Mrs. Perrette told them that she had just baked some cookies and made some fresh lemonade and wondered if they wanted to come to a little tea party in her backyard. Katie looked at Orbie to see what he wanted to do, but Orbie was already halfway up the steps, and with a laugh, Katie ran after him. They called Mom to ask if they could stay for a visit, and she said yes. With a tray full of lemonade and cookies, Mrs. Perrette led them out to her backyard. The backyard was very magical. She had plants and vegetables growing everywhere, and on one side was a huge old weeping willow tree. It was Katie and Orbie's favorite place to hide or tell secrets, because the long willow branches came right down and touched the ground, making it feel like a private world. Mrs. Perrette was telling them that she was delighted to have them over for tea, as she was feeling a little lonely today. I have to say that made Katie feel sad. And she wondered how she could feel lonely when all the children in the neighborhood loved her so much. Katie told her this, and Mrs. Perrette smiled. It meant a lot to her. Orbie burbled that she was just like Katie's granny to them, because Katie's real granny lived so far away. Mrs. Perrette put her hand to her heart. She wasn't lonely anymore. Katie looked at the lush green garden and told Mrs. Perrette that she and Orbie had been playing magical things all morning. That made her smile. She loved magic. Katie beamed at her and added that she thought that there must be a whole lot of magic in her backyard. No other backyard in the whole neighborhood felt like hers. Mrs. Perrette told Katie that she had given her a real compliment. And at that moment, two things happened. The first thing was that the telephone rang. Mrs. Perrette asked Orbie to get it for her so that she wouldn't have to run. Running wasn't easy when you're older. Orbie leapt over his chair and ran into the kitchen to answer it. The second thing, and you really had to be listening to hear it, it was the tiniest tinkling sound Katie had ever heard. As Mrs. Perrette went into the kitchen to take the call from her daughter, Orbie popped out again and flopped back onto his comfy lawn chair. Katie leaned forward and whispered to Orbie to be very quiet and listen. Orbie wondered what she could be listening for. And at that very moment, it happened again. A teeny, tiny tinkle. Katie got up and tiptoed over to Orbie. She whispered to him that she was pretty sure that that was a fairy bell, and that the fairies were getting ready to dance. At first, Orbie wondered why she thought such a thing, but then the music happened again. And this time, there were more musical notes. Katie whispered that she had never, ever seen a fairy dance. If they tiptoed over to where they heard the tinkling chimes, they might just spy one. Orbie had never seen a fairy either. And so, in the quietest flash, he was up. The tinkling music was quiet for a while, and then the two friends heard it again. Orbie thought it was coming from the flower garden, and so he tiptoed over for a peek. Katie thought maybe it was near the bird bath, and so she tiptoed over and snuck a peek. No one saw a thing. They both looked at each other, quietly shook their heads. They stood as still as they could, listening. This time, it seemed to be coming from the garden walk. Orbie tiptoed over to it, looking carefully for the little people. Katie wondered if it wasn't coming from the ground, near the long willow branches, and this is where their search picked up. Katy saw nothing, but the tinkling sound was definitely a little louder. Katy quietly signaled to Orbie that she was definitely getting closer. Orbie snuck over. And together, without making the smallest sound, they slowly parted the branches. They couldn't see anything, but the tinkling sound was definitely in there. So in they crept. Nothing happened for a moment, and Katy felt an excited giggle coming on. She tried not to let it out, but you know how it is with giggles. If they want to come out, they just do. So she giggled, and all of a sudden, in a very magical way, the wind picked up the branches of the trees, and the tinkling sound was louder and longer. And Katy and Orbie could tell that it was coming from above their heads. As they peeked up, they expected to see a tiny fairy sitting on a branch, playing a magical instrument. But instead, they saw a flashing silver thing high up in the tree. When the wind died down, Katy and Orbie realized it was wind chimes. I think that they were both a little disappointed that there wasn't a magical fairy ring dancing away in Mrs. Perrette's garden. But at the very same time, they laughed. They were so full of imagination today. They believed the fairies were here. Katy gave Orbie a big hug for imagining it all with her, and she whispered a secret in his ear. She asked him to pretend from this day on until they were 900 years old, which is really old, that they had really seen the fairies dancing. Orbie agreed, and as they sank back in their lawn chairs and Mrs. Perrette came out from the kitchen, they smiled at each other and told Mrs. Perrette her garden was even more magical than she'd ever believed. And do you know that from that very day on, to Katy and Orbie, it was. And you may have a special place where all kinds of imaginary things can happen. You never know, maybe one day they really will.
Did you know? Did you know? The sea comes in and out every day. That's called the tide. When it's in, it's called high tide, and low tide when it's out. But don't worry, it comes back every time. You might not want to be sunbathing when the tide comes back in.